An elderly woman with Alzheimer's opens her gate to a mysterious pit bull. What starts as a simple encounter turns into a story of loyalty, bravery, and an incredible twist you won't see coming. But first, make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more heartwarming stories like this one. Margaret sat on her porch, her weathered rocking chair creaking beneath her as she gazed out at the empty road ahead. The cool morning breeze carried a faint scent of lavender from the garden her late husband Richard had once tended. Her fingers traced the edges of her shawl, a comforting habit she'd developed since his passing. Loneliness had become Margaret's only companion since Buddy, her golden retriever, had passed away 2 years earlier. The house, once filled with laughter and movement, now echoed with silence. Her daughter, Emily, did her best to visit, but work and the distance made it difficult. Today felt especially heavy, and Margaret's thoughts drifted between reality and the fragments of memories her Alzheimer's allowed her to keep. As she stared at the metal gate at the edge of her property, Margaret noticed movement. Narrowing her eyes, she focused on a shadowy figure approaching. At first, she thought it might be one of the neighbors, but as the figure grew closer, she realized it was a large, muscular dog with a sleek gray coat. Her heart skipped a beat. The dog's powerful frame and steady gait reminded her of Buddy, though its dark gray fur was different from her golden retriever's. Margaret leaned forward in her chair, gripping the armrests. "Buddy?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The dog stopped just outside the gate, its piercing gaze meeting hers. It stood there, still as a statue, as if waiting for her permission to enter. Margaret hesitated. She glanced around the empty yard, confirming that she was alone, then looked back at the dog. There was something oddly familiar about its presence, a calmness that put her at ease despite its imposing size. "Come on in," she murmured softly, her voice carrying a mix of curiosity and longing. To her surprise, the dog pushed through the slightly ajar gate and began walking toward her. Each step was deliberate, measured, as though it didn't want to frighten her. Margaret's breath caught as the dog reached the porch and stopped at her feet. Its eyes were intelligent, almost knowing, as it looked up at her. Slowly, she extended a trembling hand. "You're not Buddy," she said, her voice breaking, "but maybe you've come to keep me company." The dog cocked its head to the side, then leaned into her touch as she gently ran her fingers over its head. Its fur was rough but warm, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. "I think I'll call you Max," she said with a small smile. Max settled on the porch beside her, lying down as though he belonged there. Margaret felt a wave of peace wash over her. For the first time in a long while, the emptiness didn't feel so overwhelming. The next morning, Margaret woke with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. She hurried to the porch, her heart pounding at the thought that Max might have been a fleeting dream. But there he was, lying by the steps, his head resting on his paws. As soon as he saw her, he sat up, wagging his tail slightly. "Good morning, Max," she said warmly, moving to her rocking chair. Max followed her every step with his eyes, then nudged her hand with his nose when she sat down. Margaret chuckled, running her hand along his back. "I guess you're here to stay, huh?" For the rest of the day, Max shadowed Margaret wherever she went. He followed her into the garden as she tended to the lavender, his watchful presence both reassuring and endearing. When Margaret paused to catch her breath, Max sat beside her, his steady gaze fixed on her as if he understood her fragility. Later that afternoon, Margaret's daughter Emily called. "Mom, how are you feeling today?" Emily's voice was filled with concern, as always. "I'm doing much better," Margaret replied, glancing at Max, who was lying near the porch steps. "I have some company now." "Company?" Emily sounded surprised. "Did someone stop by?" "Not someone," Margaret said with a laugh. "It's a dog. A big gray pit bull. He showed up at the gate yesterday, and now he's here with me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mom, you don't know where that dog came from. What if it's dangerous?" Margaret looked at Max, who lifted his head and wagged his tail slightly. "He's not dangerous, Emily. He reminds me of Buddy. I think he's here to look after me." Emily sighed. "Just promise me you'll be careful, okay?" "I will," Margaret said, though she already felt completely safe with Max. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret sat on the porch with Max at her feet. The quiet moments between them felt natural, almost as if they had always been part of each other's lives. She leaned back in her chair, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "You're a good boy, Max," she murmured, her hand resting on his head. Max let out a contented sigh, his body relaxing against the porch floor. Margaret felt her heart lighten. For the first time in years, she didn't mind the silence of the house. Max's presence filled the emptiness, offering her a sense of companionship she thought she had lost forever. The sun crept slowly over the horizon as Margaret stepped onto her porch. She paused for a moment, gripping the railing, and scanned the yard with cautious hope. There he was, Max, lying in the same spot by the steps where she had left him the night before. The sight of the pit bull filled her with an unexpected joy. It was a feeling she hadn't known in years. "Good morning, Max," she greeted, her voice softer than she had intended. The dog lifted his head and wagged his tail, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet intelligence. Margaret eased into her rocking chair, wincing slightly at the creak of the wood beneath her. Max moved closer, resting his head on her lap. She smiled as her hand instinctively found its way to his fur. "You're staying, aren't you?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Well, I suppose I could use the company." Later that morning, Margaret wandered into the garden, watering the lavender bushes that lined the edge of the porch. She had always loved the scent, though she hadn't tended to the plants much since Richard passed. Max trailed closely behind her, his large frame moving silently across the yard. As Margaret bent to pull a weed from the soil, she lost her balance and stumbled. Max was there in an instant, his strong body steadying her before she could fall. "Oh, thank you, Max," she murmured, patting his head. "You're already looking out for me, aren't you?" The dog's steady presence gave her confidence to keep moving through the garden, her steps surer with him by her side. It was as if he could sense her fragility and was determined to protect her. That afternoon, Margaret settled into her chair with a cup of tea. The warmth of the drink and Max's quiet companionship made the house feel a little less empty. When the phone rang, she sighed and set her cup down. It was Emily, her daughter, checking in as usual. "Hi, Mom." Emily's cheerful voice came through the receiver. "How are you doing today?" Margaret glanced at Max, who was lying on the floor beside her, his eyes half closed. "I'm doing well, actually," she replied. "I have some company now." Emily hesitated. "Oh? Did one of the neighbors stop by?" "Not exactly," Margaret said with a small laugh. "It's a dog, a big gray pit bull. He showed up yesterday, and I think he's decided to stay." There was a long pause. "Mom," Emily said finally, her voice tinged with concern. "You don't know where he came from. What if he's dangerous?" Margaret looked down at Max, who lifted his head at the sound of her voice. "He's not dangerous," she said firmly. "He's gentle and kind. He reminds me of Buddy." Emily sighed on the other end of the line. Just be careful, okay? You don't know his history." "I will," Margaret promised, though she already felt completely safe with Max by her side. The days began to take on a new rhythm. Max followed Margaret everywhere she went, his watchful eyes and calm demeanor a constant source of comfort. In the mornings, they would sit together on the porch watching the sun rise over the countryside. In the afternoons, he would accompany her through the garden, his presence steadying her unsteady steps. Margaret found herself talking to Max more and more. She told him about Richard, about Buddy, about Emily and the years they had spent together in this house. Max listened silently, his head resting on her lap, his eyes fixed on her as if he understood every word. One day, as Margaret sat in the shade of the porch, she noticed a subtle change in herself. The heavy weight of loneliness that had pressed down on her for so long seemed to have lifted. She felt lighter, more alive. Max had given her a reason to wake up in the morning, a reason to keep moving. As the sun set one evening, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Margaret sat on her rocking chair with Max at her feet. The countryside was quiet, save for the soft chirping of crickets in the distance. Margaret reached down to stroke Max's head, a smile spreading across her face. "You've brought me back to life," she said softly. "I don't know where you came from, but I'm glad you're here." Max let out a contented sigh, his body relaxing against the cool wood of the porch. Margaret leaned back in her chair, feeling for the first time in years that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The day had passed peacefully, with Margaret and Max settling into their new routine. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the house bathed in a soft orange glow. Margaret prepared for bed. Max followed her closely, his large frame moving silently through the house like a shadow. "Good night, Max," she whispered as she turned off the light, leaving him lying by the front door. His steady presence gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. Margaret awoke to a faint noise. At first she thought it was part of a dream, but then she heard it again, soft whispers and the unmistakable sound of something scraping against metal. Her heart raced. She sat up in bed, straining to listen. The noise was coming from the direction of her bedroom window. "Max," she whispered into the darkness. A low growl answered her, followed by the sound of heavy paws moving toward the back of the house. Fear gripped Margaret as she slid out of bed and reached for her robe. She peeked around the corner of her bedroom door, watching as Max moved with purpose, his body low to the ground, his ears perked up. She followed him cautiously, her hands trembling. As she approached the living room, Margaret froze. Through the window she saw the silhouettes of two men. One of them was fiddling with the lock on the back door, while the other held a flashlight. The beam darted around the room, landing briefly on the family photos lining the walls. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe this was happening. Her small farmhouse had always felt safe, untouched by the dangers of the world. But now, her sanctuary was being invaded. "Max," she whispered again, her voice shaking. The pit bull turned to look at her, his eyes sharp and alert. He seemed to understand the fear in her voice. Without a sound, he padded toward the door, his muscles taut with tension. The intruders didn't notice Max until it was too late. The dog sprang forward, letting out a deep, resonant bark that echoed through the quiet night. The man at the door stumbled back, dropping his flashlight, which clattered noisily to the ground. "What the—" the second man started, but his words were cut off as Max bared his teeth, a low growl rumbling from deep within his chest. His stance was firm, his eyes locked onto the men like a predator assessing his prey. The first man, regaining his composure, raised his foot to kick the dog. Max dodged the blow with agility, lunging forward and grabbing hold of the man's pant leg. The man let out a startled cry as he was yanked to the ground. "Let's get out of here," the second man yelled, backing away. He dropped the bag of stolen items he was holding and bolted toward the fence. His partner scrambled to his feet, limping as he followed, glancing nervously over his shoulder at the snarling pit bull. Margaret, watching from the doorway, felt a mixture of fear and awe. She clutched the doorframe, her heart pounding as the men disappeared into the night. When the house fell silent again, Max returned to Margaret, his tail wagging slightly as if to reassure her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she knelt down, wrapping her arms around his thick neck. "Thank you, Max," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You saved me." Max nuzzled her shoulder, his warm breath a comfort against her cheek. In that moment, Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had let this dog into her life on a whim, but he had already proven himself to be more than just a companion. He was her protector. The next morning, the reality of the night's events began to sink in. Margaret sat on the porch with Max lying at her feet, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She glanced at the back door, where the lock hung broken, and the memory of the intruders sent a shiver down her spine. Emily called, as she always did. "Mom, are you okay? You sound off." Margaret hesitated, unsure of how to explain. "There were men here last night," she finally admitted. "They tried to break in." "What?" Emily's voice was sharp with concern. "Are you hurt? Did you call the police?" "No, I'm fine," Margaret reassured her. "Max scared them off. He was incredible, Emily. I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't been here." There was a pause. "Mom?" Emily said softly. "Are you sure you're okay living there alone? Maybe it's time to move closer to me." Margaret looked down at Max, who was watching her with his steady, unwavering gaze. She shook her head, even though Emily couldn't see. "I'm not alone," she said firmly. "Not anymore." For the rest of the day, Margaret noticed a change in the way she moved through the house. Where she had once been cautious, always checking over her shoulder, she now felt a sense of ease. Max was there, and she trusted him completely. The neighbors, curious about the commotion from the night before, stopped by to check on her. Margaret recounted the story with a mixture of pride and disbelief, always ending with, "And Max, he was so brave. I don't know how I got so lucky." The visitors would glance at the large pit bull lying on the porch, his posture relaxed but his eyes always alert. Some offered cautious praise, while others seemed wary of his size and strength. But Margaret didn't care. She knew the truth. Max wasn't just a dog, he was her guardian angel. The morning after the attempted break-in felt surreal to Margaret. As she sat on the porch with her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea, her mind replayed the events of the previous night. The sight of Max standing guard, his growl a barrier between her and danger, was etched vividly in her memory. Margaret glanced down at Max, who lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. He seemed calm now, but she knew that his watchful nature was ever present. "You really are my hero," she murmured, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. Later that day, Emily arrived in a flurry of concern. Her car screeched to a halt in the gravel driveway, and she hurried up the porch steps. "Mom, are you okay? I couldn't stop worrying after you told me what happened," she exclaimed, pulling Margaret into a tight embrace. "I'm fine," Margaret assured her, though Emily's worried expression said she wasn't convinced. Emily's eyes darted to Max, who was sitting quietly beside Margaret, his posture alert but relaxed. "And this is the dog?" Emily asked hesitantly, keeping her distance. "The one who scared off the intruders?" "Yes, this is Max," Margaret said proudly, patting his head. "He's the reason I'm safe." Emily eyed Max warily. "He's big. Are you sure he's safe, Mom?" Margaret chuckled softly. "Emily, he's as gentle as they come. He's already become part of the family." Max, as if sensing Emily's unease, stood and wagged his tail lightly. He took a cautious step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. Emily hesitated, but when Max gently nudged her hand with his nose, she couldn't help but smile. "Well, I guess he does seem sweet," she admitted, stroking his head. Word of Max's bravery spread quickly through the small community. Neighbors who had been cautious about the large pit bull began stopping by to see him. Mr. Johnson, the friendly man who lived next door, arrived later that afternoon with a bag of treats. "So this is the hero we've been hearing about," Mr. Johnson said, tipping his hat as he approached the porch. Max sat calmly beside Margaret, his tail thumping lightly against the wooden boards. "He certainly is," Margaret replied with a warm smile. "I don't know what I would have done without him." Mr. Johnson knelt down, offering a treat in his outstretched hand. Max sniffed it carefully before taking it gently. "Well, I'll be," Mr. Johnson said, chuckling. "He's a good one, Margaret. You're lucky to have him." "I know," Margaret said, her voice full of gratitude. "He's brought something back into my life that I thought I'd lost." That evening, Margaret and Emily sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the hills. Max lay at Margaret's feet, his eyes half closed but his ears still perked. The tranquility of the moment was a stark contrast to the fear that had gripped the house just the night before. "You know, Mom," Emily said, breaking the silence, "I think Max has done more than just protect you. He's brought you back to life. Margaret looked down at Max, her hand resting on his head. He has, she agreed softly. I don't feel so alone anymore. Emily smiled, a mixture of relief and warmth in her expression. I think he's meant to be here with you. Maybe it's time to make it official. Margaret's eyes lit up. You mean, adopt him? Emily nodded. He's already family, isn't he? Margaret laughed, a sound that had become rare in recent years. Yes, he is. The following day, Margaret and Emily visited the local animal shelter to complete Max's adoption paperwork. The staff were surprised to hear about his heroics, and several people gathered around to hear the story. Margaret recounted the events with pride, her voice steady and confident. As they left the shelter, Max walked beside Margaret, his head held high as if he understood the significance of the moment. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt like she was moving forward, no longer weighed down by the past. The days after Max's heroic act passed with a sense of calm that Margaret hadn't felt in years. The fear from the break-in faded into a distant memory, replaced by the comfort of Max's steadfast presence. Word of his bravery had spread through the community, and neighbors now stopped by to check on Margaret and meet her courageous companion. One sunny afternoon, as Margaret sat on the porch with Max lounging at her feet, a car pulled into the driveway. The unfamiliar vehicle stirred Max, who rose to his feet, his ears perked and his body tense. Margaret squinted against the sunlight, watching as a tall man stepped out of the car and approached. "Good afternoon," the man called, his voice steady but hesitant. "I hope I'm not intruding." Margaret rose slowly, leaning on the porch railing for support. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious. The man stopped at the bottom of the steps, his eyes fixed on Max. "My name is Tom Miller," he said, his gaze softening. "I couldn't help but notice the dog. He looks familiar." Margaret frowned, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "This is Max," she said firmly. "He's been with me for a while now." Tom nodded, taking a deep breath. "I think Max might actually be Rocky, my dog. He went missing months ago during a storm. I've been searching for him ever since." Margaret's grip tightened on the porch railing. "Are you sure? He's become a part of my family." Tom smiled faintly. "I don't mean to upset you, ma'am. Rocky, Max, was more than just a pet to me. He helped me through some tough times, and losing him felt like losing a piece of myself." Max, sensing the tension, moved closer to Margaret, standing protectively by her side. Tom crouched slightly, extending his hand toward the dog. "Hey, Rocky," he said softly. To Margaret's surprise, Max took a step forward, sniffing Tom's hand before wagging his tail slightly. The sight made her heart ache. Could it be true? Had Max belonged to someone else all along? Margaret cleared her throat, her voice trembling. "He's been my companion, my protector. I don't know what I'd do without him." Tom stood, his expression thoughtful. "I can see how much he means to you," he said quietly. "And I think he's where he's meant to be now. It's clear he's bonded with you." Relief washed over Margaret, though it was tinged with guilt. "Are you sure? I don't want to take him from you." Tom smiled. "Rocky always had a way of finding people who needed him most. Maybe that's what he's done here. If he's happy and loved, that's all I could ever want for him." After Tom left, Margaret sat on the porch with Max, her hand resting on his head. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for Tom's understanding, but for the second chance Max had brought into her life. "You're not just a protector, Max," she said softly. "You're a gift." Max leaned into her touch, his eyes filled with the same unwavering loyalty she had come to cherish.